Hello, my fellow thinkers and dreamers. This is Mind Palace Musings, and I am your host, David Wellman. The universe is an interesting place. It is where we live, and despite having lived here for roughly 12,000 years in our current state, we don't know much about it. One ongoing theory which gains more and more traction every day in the modern world is that our universe is simulated. And this can fall under something called simulation theory. The simulation theory states that all of reality, including the Earth and the universe, is in fact an artificial simulation, most likely a computer simulation. And there is some philosophical backing to this as far back as antiquity, as existence was questioned as a dream or as an illusion. Today we will be discussing our universe being simulated by technology, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is the case. But it is the case for this episode. So, without further ado, let's get started. Let's get started with some assumptions. First assumption being that the universe as we know it is simulated, either by a complex program, technological or biological machine, a dream, or something we cannot comprehend as humans. We may either be native entities of the simulation or visitors from the outside. The simulation is compelling enough that we are not able to discern that it is a simulation, and the same goes for the entities inside the simulation that are not visiting from the outside. The simulation has ways to self-correct if something goes wrong or we see something that we're not meant to. And like a virtual machine, the simulation can be stopped and started at any time and spun up from any point in time with the participants having no idea that this has happened. For the benefit of my listeners that don't have a background in the IT world, programming, technology, things like that, a virtual machine is essentially a computer running inside your computer. If you have a computer, that software is typically running directly on the hardware that you have it installed on, whereas a virtual machine is a machine within the machine. Yes, that brings some Inception levels of thought, don't worry about it. But basically, because it's virtual and because it all exists in software, it can be turned on and off at a whim with the actual virtual machine itself not really knowing that any of this is happening, which could be how the simulation of our universe works, and to be honest and fair, probably is how it works if this has been developed by competent programmers, which it probably would have to be, otherwise it wouldn't be as compelling as it is. That being said, the compelling nature of the simulation could all be fake and false. What we see may not be even close to what the simulation is actually doing, and it may simply be because of the way we are being simulated that we can see things the way that they are not. So, talking about this technological marvel that is the ability to simulate reality, we'll start with the most readily discussed and easily accepted theory of simulation by the mainstream, and that is the ancestor simulation. It's not accepted in the mainstream in ways that other theories are, like evolution. I suppose I should be calling this a hypothesis, because while in the English language theory means one thing, in the science world it means a completely different thing. So yes, the ancestor simulation is purely speculative and philosophical, and that is why mainstream scientists and biologists throw it out. But this is a philosophy podcast, so let's explore it. This is proposed heavily by philosopher Nick Bostrom. His simulation argument does not directly argue that we live in a simulation. Instead, he puts forward a trilemma which argues that one of three unlikely seeming propositions is almost certainly true. And those are: the fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage, that is, one capable of running high-fidelity ancestor simulations, is very close to zero. Or the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof is very close to zero. Or the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. Essentially, any civilization that makes it far enough to run ancestor simulations probably will, meaning that there are currently more universes that are simulated than not, which also brings into question the multiverse and alternate realities, but not the point of this episode. If we are not in a simulation, then it's unlikely our descendants will run ancestor simulations. Basically stating that if we don't think today, in the current day, that one day we will run ancestor simulations, then we never will. But if we do think that down the line our our descendants will run ancestor simulations, then we are probably already being simulated. The idea that we are living in base reality then becomes very low as you consider how many simulations could be run. One base reality could create an endless amount of simulations, and depending on how deep those simulations are allowed to run, we could even be in a simulation within a simulation within a simulation ad nauseum forever. Now, that's one part of the argument, and that is the part that scientists are most interested in. The question of, are we in a simulation? We'll never know. Maybe we will. As mentioned, the simulation probably has ways to correct itself. If we ever discover that we're in a simulation, one, the simulation might end because maybe there's some ethical reasons to end it once the inhabitants are aware of it. Or two, we might simply just be rolled back to a point where we don't have that evidence and that path of discovery is completely blocked out. We are blocked out from discovering it's a simulation, and this may have happened any number of times already. So what I'm more interested in is, why are we in a simulation? I think that's the more interesting question. I think the simulation, if we're still going on the ancestor simulation, could be to exist to study what ifs. What would happen if this happens at this time? What would happen if this person died at this time or were saved from death? It allows us to study every single thing that could have happened that did not happen in the timeline of base reality. It may also exist to gather lost history, which would mean everything is deterministic and nothing is random, and also that there is no free will, because it means the universe has a starting seed, and every chaotic action happening from there is based off of that number. Now, in programming terms, a seed is basically a value. Let's say the number 1, or the amount of seconds that have elapsed since the start of the universe, or just a random string of letters like your name, which isn't actually that random. Anyway, this is how modern computers do random numbers. There's no such thing as a true random number in computing. Computers are not capable of producing random numbers, but they can produce what is random enough for our uses, compelling enough to show a human, hey, this is a random number. Anyway, it's all based off of that starting seed, which you give it a seed, and everything that every time a random number is pulled, it'll be the same one in the same sequence if you give it the same seed. If you've ever played any modern roguelike game, or even the older ones, that, for those who don't know what a roguelike game is, basically every time you play the game, it generates a new world for you to play in. All of those, or even Minecraft's a good example. Minecraft, every world has a seed, and that way you can play the same world as a friend just by giving them the same seed. If you give it the same seed, it will generate the same world every time without fail. Which would mean if we did somehow know that seed of a deterministic universe, we'd be able to simulate everything that would happen. Which would mean that branching paths would not be possible, because everything that has happened will happen. Which means we could study the branching paths if we simply changed the seed, which might also lead to humans not ever existing, but that's not the point. Now, this also brings into question if the base reality is deterministic or not, or how many layers deep we are. This is something very difficult to test. Not the questions I just posed, but if we are in a simulation, and not much effort or resources have been put into testing it. It's difficult to tell from the inside. I mentioned virtual machines earlier, these computers within a computer. They're basically a sandboxed environment, which means anything you do in that environment does not affect the world outside of it. And a way that banks deal with hackers is by putting sandbox environments kind of out there as juicy targets for people to hack into, and they don't really know that they're in a virtual computer. If it's convincing enough, you have no idea. Now, some believe that we must continue to be interesting and to do interesting things, because if we stop, the simulation might end as well. This idea that they would patch out our discoveries of the fact that we're living in a simulation might be explained by some of the strange happenings and reality glitches that we see, though I'll discuss these in detail a bit later. And it's even possible that the developers of the simulation were more active in the past, which may lead to all the accounts of the ancient world, of these encounters with strange mythical beings and gods and storms that destroyed the earth. Perhaps Noah's flood was an allegory to a server wipe. So that is the most accepted idea in the mainstream, as far accepted as it is, that this is an ancestor simulation. But I have some potential ideas of what else it could be, so let's discuss those. We could be living in an existential number cruncher. Those who simulate us might not be human. The simulations being run might be to calculate every facet of existence and to experience every facet of novelty. I've talked about novelty before, and I do think that is one of the meanings of life. And I know it's maybe a controversial thing to say, hey, life might have this specific meaning. But the evidence is there that when we experience new things, we experience time differently. If you watch a 15-second video clip, the first time you watch it, it's going to feel a lot longer. And the second time you watch it, it'll feel a lot shorter. Because every new thing we experience, our brain grapples onto it and lets us experience it in the full for that first time. This aligns with the theory of the egg and reincarnation, that every facet of humanity must be explored, and there may be other forms of existence that are also currently being explored by these simulations that aren't human and that we may or may not get to experience one day. We may just be an evolutionary sandbox by another sentient advanced race who want to see what life might look like if it wasn't their own. It's not that old at this point, but a game from about a decade ago by Maxis called Spore, that was the whole idea of the game. It was your universe in a box where you would kind of grow up these creatures, this alien species from the cell stage all the way to getting to space, and we might just be a more advanced form of that. It might also mean that the universe is as empty as we fear it to be, and that life on Earth has been specifically seeded. Perhaps life is truly so rare that only one species has ever evolved, and they've used that place of privilege and existence to simulate everything else. This could also be the greatest game of life ever known. Conway's Game of Life is a programming exercise. It's a very simple simulation with very simple rules in which cells either live or die based on the state of their neighbors. Very simple rules that, depending on the scale, can be used to create such advanced features as calculators and even computers. Now, keep in mind, this is a simple simulation in which things only have two states, alive or dead. If we expand that to a universal scale, you could theoretically simulate everything with just a few simple rules. Perhaps the way that electrons behave with neurons and protons, or the behavior of the smaller particles that govern that. Less depressing, let's put our agency back into the simulation, and let's say that we aren't native entities of the simulation, that we are instead peering in from the outside. Perhaps this is the greatest VR game in existence. As VR improves in our own physical existence now, it's not infeasible that one day it will be indistinguishable from real life. Some people nowadays even say that they sometimes forget they are playing a game when they put on that headset. Real existence may be us sitting somewhere with a headset on that is bouncing signals to our brain. If you think about the way we interact with our current world, it's through our senses. If you can boil it down to signals being sent to our brain, who says that those signals couldn't be produced externally and sent to us through some kind of advanced headset? What feels like a lifetime in this game may only be hours or minutes in the real world, and this is an experience people on psychedelics have reported on, with intense experiences like ayahuasca and DMT potentially feeling like months or even a lifetime, when in reality it's only been a few minutes or a few hours. Or even waking up from a long sleep or a dream that feels like it's been going on forever, but it hasn't. Perhaps this is a form of therapy, a way to live out a life that is no longer available to us in the real world for whatever reason, or a way to cope with the tragedy that is still to come. Or perhaps it's a way to train skills in a way that just makes more sense. Imagine being able to plug yourself into a simulation, dial up the settings so that you're born into a life that puts you on the path of learning these skills, and through a lifetime of living in a simulation, you will wake up in the real world with that skill, being a master in it. Or, more depressingly, perhaps life in the real world has gotten so unbearable and depressing that we need this as an escape. Perhaps we have destroyed the planet and we can't go outside anymore, and this is our way to escape our hellhole. Maybe this is a prison. In the popular movie The Matrix, this is explored, where humanity has been enslaved by machines for their body heat. Now, honestly, humans suck as far as batteries go. If we were to be harvested for anything, it should be our conscious energy, the thoughts and feelings that we feel. It's not batteries. I mean, you know, as far as body heat for batteries goes, that's very silly. But anyway, perhaps we are in prison for some horrible crime we committed that we just no longer know of, and that we must live many lives to atone for this. Or, going back to us being native entities of the simulation, perhaps human society has gotten so advanced that it no longer has natural births, people are no longer born, and they no longer die. Perhaps the simulation is a way to find new human lives to bring into the world. They simulate a universe that would produce a suitable candidate, and perhaps there are viewers bidding on us every day. If we get enough votes, perhaps we are brought into the real world, into a synthetic body with our same immortal consciousness. If we are found not to be desirable, then maybe we're recycled back to live another life, or just left to die. This isn't too far from some religious theories on karma, that we must perfect ourselves over many lifetimes to reach a state of nirvana, where we can live in eternity as a higher state of being. Perhaps that higher state of being is immortality in a perfect body, in a world that no longer has pain. Violent tragedies or accidents that we think have just happened to the best people that didn't deserve it may just be a way to get people out of the simulation once they're happy with them. This could also be an archaeological retelling. Perhaps some horrible calamity that we still can't even wrap our heads around is still to come. One that future archaeologists will want to see with our own eyes, and perhaps we're just a corpse or a bunch of bones lying on a table being prodded by futuristic tech, and they're forcing us to relive our life for study. Maybe it happens tomorrow, who knows? I mentioned earlier that some people have picked up on glitches in the simulation, the biggest one being the Mandela Effect. Now, the Mandela Effect is named after Nelson Mandela because many people remember him dying in prison in the 1980s, which is not the case because he lived until 2013. And I know this quite intimately because I'm South African. So, yeah. But that's not the point. A lot of people remember him dying. They remember the newspapers and the headlines. Nelson Mandela dead, riots. Maybe it did happen. And maybe it's not what our simulators wanted to happen, so it was rolled back. But the merging of these two timelines left some latent memories. Computer bugs happen all the time. Programmers are not very good at what we do, and I say that as a programmer. We can build incredibly complex systems, but bugs they're unavoidable, they happen. Perhaps the memory transfer program or subroutine or whatever you want to call it is imperfect. It's probably very difficult to move memories across from one reality to another. Some say the Mandela Effect could just be a form of, mass misremembering. Some say it points to alternate realities, and some say that it is a glitch in the simulation. What we could also look at as glitches in the simulation is more paranormal events like ghosts and specters and possessions. Perhaps these are just entities that have not been properly deleted, still trying to perform their normal actions, but glitching the simulation in such a way that they just are terrifying. If you look at any glitches in a game, like a Bethesda game, for example, you'll see it looks horrifying. Characters have their limbs spread out and they might fly or talk from beyond the death or zip around like a crackhead on meth. It's maybe not that different from real life. Glitches can have horrible unintended side effects, and that might be what we see. Perhaps as time has gone on, the simulation has improved. They've added bug fixes, they've added updates, and maybe that's why our ancestors reported more paranormal activity than they do nowadays. So, what about when I die? Well, firstly, there's not zero chance that you're immortal because you haven't died yet, but that's not the point. Perhaps it's a game over screen displaying all your stats, or perhaps you get a brief moment of awareness as a brain in a jar as you wait for the next simulation to be started. Perhaps it is simply nothingness, the void, an endless lack of awareness as they free your memory for a new entity in the simulation. Or maybe it's your therapist giving you a warm, reassuring touch on your shoulder, telling you that you've completed your session. Or a tribunal discussing your actions in the simulated life and how many more lives you will have to live to pay off your sentence. Perhaps you wake up in a lab in a malnourished body as unfamiliar creatures poke and prod you, getting you ready for the next simulation. Or perhaps it's a selection screen allowing you to pick specifications for your next life, only for it to be forgotten as you gestate in the womb, waiting to be reborn into the server. The biggest implication of this is that none of this is real. Or maybe it's all real and this is as real as it will ever get. Or maybe it's somewhere in between. We might have been born in this simulation, or we might just be visiting from the outside without any memories of the real world. It's as real as we know it to be, so we might as well treat it as such. There may be a truer or more real reality outside of it, but we don't know that for a fact. Live in the now and enjoy every moment you have, because it might be turned off, never to be turned back on at any moment. It can be easy to simply brush this off as fake and turn to a life of hedonism and just not caring about the world, but that's not a good way to live, because this may be all we get, or we may have to suffer many more lifetimes for performing the incorrect actions. I hope I didn't send you into too much of an existential spiral this episode, but it can be fun, so you're welcome. This is an incredibly broad topic that I could spend many episodes talking about, and I will. Next episode, I'm going to be talking about another direction we could look at this whole argument of the universe and it being a dream, perhaps, not a simulation. But in any case, thank you for listening, my fellow thinkers and dreamers, my dear seekers of truth and knowledge. I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. It's been really fun, just building a community, slowly growing. So if you do like the podcast, why don't you consider joining the discussion on Reddit at r/mindpalacemusings, or following the Twitter account for updates. That's at mpm_podcast. And if you are enjoying, please do consider leaving a like or a comment or a follow or a subscribe. I don't know what platform you're listening to this on. I'm sure they have something similar. For any other details, you can find it all in the description of this episode. This has been Mind Palace Musings, and I have been your host, David Wellman. Thanks for listening, and stay curious.